What God afflicts, he forms to free. What man afflicts, he claims as fee. Few scriptural sentences have traveled farther from their linguistic origins than the oft-quoted line, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." In English, it sounds complete, polished, almost proverbial. A self-contained moral statement contrasting material and spiritual sustenance. This surface clarity, however, is the result of centuries of interpretive condensation. The Hebrew text of Deuteronomy 8:3 that underlies it is not a compact maxim, but a dense sequence of 7 verbal constructions, each with its own grammar of relation and intention. The popular translation has therefore imposed simplicity upon a passage whose power lies precisely in its complexity. Traditional exegesis has reinforced this compression. Rabbinic interpreters such as Rashi and Ibn Ezra read the verse through the lens of divine pedagogy. Israel's suffering and hunger were a test to teach dependence on God. The Midrash Rabbah elaborated this into an ethical principle, claiming that bread itself does not grant life unless blessed by divine decree. Christian theology inherited and reshaped the verse in the Gospels, where Jesus cites it during his temptation in the wilderness as a declaration of spiritual fidelity. Patristic commentators, from Augustine to Aquinas, treated it as a contrast between fleshly need and divine word, and modern devotional readings continue this line, treating the text as a moral axiom about the soul's higher nourishment. Each of these traditions, though rich in spiritual insight, tends to translate the Hebrew experience of sequence and relation into an abstract opposition between body and spirit. The result is a verse that speaks about dependence on God but no longer enacts it. The Hebrew text itself resists such flattening. Its verbs are not static but dynamically interlinked by the vav conversive, which binds each clause into temporal and causal continuity. The repeated second-person suffix, ka, keeps the discourse personal and relational, while the choice of hifil stems, he caused to hunger, he made to know, introduces mediated agency, a pattern of divine causation rather than direct command. What English presents as a linear moral statement is, in Hebrew, a choreography of interaction. God acts, Israel receives, time unfolds, and knowledge arises. The theology is written in the morphology. By examining the verse through triadic logical structures, we recover this lost grammar of relationship. Each triad, whether conjoined, convergent, or harmonic, represents a mode of interaction between God and humanity. Affliction, hunger, and sustenance are not discrete episodes, but successive configurations of dependence and revelation. The shift from negation, not by bread alone, to affirmation, by every utterance from the mouth of Yahweh, is not simply contrastive but harmonic. The same verb, yikyeh, shall live, resonates through both, transforming absence into presence. Thus, a deeper linguistic and logical reading reveals what the English translation conceals. The verse is not an ethical slogan, but a theological system encoded in morphology. Every prefix and suffix participates in a relational logic that culminates in the recognition that life, chayim, is neither autonomous nor accidental, but a dynamic equilibrium between divine utterance and human reception. This is the task of the analysis that follows, to move from the oversimplified proverb to the structured revelation beneath it, from translation to transformation. The verse opens not with nourishment, but with negation. Before bread, before speech, there is affliction, the moment in which dependence first acquires form. The Hebrew verb vaya'anaka encapsulates an entire theology of relationship in 3 syllables. The prefixed vav carries the vav conversive, marking temporal continuation and narrative movement. It binds the clause to the larger sequence, ensuring that affliction is not an isolated act, but one event in a living chain of divine instruction. The verbal stem ya'an derives from ana, a root that can mean to afflict, to answer, or to humble, an ambiguity already suggesting reciprocity rather than cruelty. Finally, the suffixed ka, you, establishes personal direction. The act is not abstract but addressed. Syntactically, this triad forms a complete relational unit. The conjunction of the temporal prefix, the active verb, and the personal suffix requires both a subject and an object. It demands encounter. Affliction here is impossible without time, without agency, and without an identified recipient. The Hebrew does not allow for an impersonal suffering. Grammar itself refuses it. The word binds the divine actor, the human respondent, and the temporal moment into a single structure of causation and experience. This morphology yields an important theological implication. Affliction, in the biblical sense, is not arbitrary pain, but the point at which divine will intersects human awareness. The presence of the conversive prefix ensures that the act unfolds within a sequence already in motion, a continuation, not an intrusion. The suffering of Israel is written as a grammatical necessity within the story's rhythm. The verbal form situates pain inside a continuum of purpose rather than outside of it. To translate merely, "He afflicted you," strips away this dimension, leaving a moralized event where the original expresses an ontological relation. In this light, affliction becomes the first articulation of identity. It defines the you to whom the entire discourse is addressed. Until affliction is introduced, Israel is the collective wanderer. After it, Israel becomes a recipient of meaning. The morphology forces recognition. To be afflicted is to be called by name within the unfolding of time. The narrative begins not with sustenance, but with particularity through trial. The divine act, the human response, and the temporal flow together constitute the grammar of encounter. Thus, the initial clause of Deuteronomy 8:3 is not merely the setting of a scene, but the establishment of the system through which the rest of the verse must be read. Affliction inaugurates the sequence of dependence. It opens the relational field in which hunger, provision, knowledge, and ultimately life itself will unfold. The divine he and the human you are joined not by sentiment, but by syntax. The act of affliction becomes the hinge upon which the entire theology of the verse turns. Grammar as covenant, suffering as recognition. The second clause advances the movement initiated by affliction. Having established the grammar of relation, the text now deepens it through the grammar of privation. The Hebrew form YHWH continues the same triadic composition. The conversive vav binds this act temporally to the one before it. The verbal nucleus yarev derives from the root raev in the hifil stem, indicating causation rather than spontaneous occurrence, and the suffix ka again directs the action toward the same recipient. Taken together, the clause literally means, "and he caused you to hunger." But the morphology reveals something subtler. Hunger is not a passive state, but a caused condition, intentionally introduced into the sequence of instruction. The hifil form is decisive. In Hebrew, to move a verb into this stem is to shift it from experience to agency, from being hungry to being made hungry. The construction demands a subject who acts and a recipient who is acted upon, but it also inserts a conceptual mediator, the causative force that stands between will and effect. Hunger is therefore not merely the absence of food, it is an instrument of formation. Within the syntactic pattern, God does not simply withhold bread. He produces hunger as a grammatical and theological event. The verb's morphology enacts the logic of discipline through design. The retention of the suffix ka reinforces continuity. The you of affliction remains the you of hunger, and the repetition of the conversive vav maintains the same temporal current. The clause is not a new episode, but the next modulation of a continuing relation. Affliction opens awareness. Hunger defines its shape. If the first clause introduced the reality of dependence, the second names its felt form. The narrative moves from the external condition of trial to the internal landscape of desire. This progression carries deep theological resonance. Hunger is not presented as divine neglect, but as the space in which dependence becomes conscious. The grammar itself refuses any interpretation of randomness. A caused hunger presupposes intention, and intention presupposes purpose. Within the sequence of YHWH, the divine action narrows from the broad affliction of circumstance to the intimate deprivation of appetite. The human subject is not only acted upon, but refined, drawn into recognition that need itself can be revelatory. This insight dissolves the common dichotomy between abundance as blessing and lack as curse. In the syntax of Deuteronomy 8:3, both are instruments of relation. The same grammatical mechanism that joined God and Israel through suffering now joins them through emptiness. The conversation continues even when the table is bare. The Vav conversive carries the narrative forward. The story does not pause for famine. The famine is the story. Thus, YHWH stands as the second movement in the verse's unfolding symphony of dependence. Where affliction individualized Israel, naming the you within time, hunger interiorizes that identity, turning recognition into yearning. It is not the negation of life, but the hollow through which life will later be filled. In grammatical terms, it is the middle clause of relationship. God acts, man feels, and time holds them together until the next utterance. The sentence is still in motion. Revelation is still in transit. With the third clause, the grammatical motion of Deuteronomy 8:3 turns from deprivation to provision, yet the continuity of structure ensures that this provision is not reversal but integration. The Hebrew phrase vayakilka et haman retains the same triadic frame as the preceding clauses. The conversive vav sustains temporal sequence. The verbal core yachil, derived from akhal, to eat, in the hyphal stem, expresses causation, to cause to eat, to feed, and the suffix ka again personalizes the act. To this closed verbal unit, the text now appends an explicit object, the particle et marking the direct object, and haman naming it. The construction thus moves from internal relation, he fed you, to external specification, he fed you manna. The morphology is deceptively simple, yet semantically layered. The inner form vayakilka functions as a complete relational event, subject, verb, and recipient enclosed within a single word. The addition of et haman opens that enclosure, joining the hidden pronoun to a visible noun. The result is a double articulation of giving. The divine act reaches inward to the person addressed and outward to the substance offered. The syntax itself performs the theology of provision, inner and outer, unseen and seen, bound by a single act of causation. This dual structure is critical for understanding the verse's movement. The same God who caused you to hunger, YHWH, now feeds you, YHKilka. But both verbs share the same stem pattern and suffixal intimacy. The difference lies not in divine attitude, but in relational phase. The grammar reveals continuity rather than contrast. The one who engineers lack is the same who fills it. Hunger and feeding are complementary clauses within a single morphological logic of dependence. The inclusion of the explicit object haman, the manna, adds another layer. Grammatically, the direct object marker, it anchors the gift in the world of visible matter, while semantically the noun manna, from the root man, what is it, preserves the mystery of its source. Thus, the construction binds the concrete and the ineffable. The grammatical sign of specification introduces an object that itself resists specification. The syntax brings revelation into contact with materiality without collapsing either into the other. Theologically, this clause transforms causation into communion. The act of feeding is not mere sustenance but reconnection. The divine subject, the human recipient, and the gift itself form a circuit of reciprocity. Affliction had individualized, hunger had hollowed. Feeding now completes the triad by filling that hollow with relation. The manna functions as a linguistic and spiritual bridge, God's utterance made edible, the invisible word translated into the visible world. The morphology embodies that translation. One act, one verb, one motion of speech that becomes nourishment. Therefore, YHWH et haman stands as the hinge between deprivation and revelation. It confirms that divine provision is not reversal of suffering, but its fulfillment. What was empty is now shaped. What was silent now speaks through sustenance. The Hebrew grammar holds all three dimensions in tension: subject, object, and gift, revealing that true feeding, in the biblical sense, is always relational. It joins giver, receiver, and substance into a single utterance of life. The fourth clause turns the focus from divine action to human perception. The Hebrew phrase, asher lo yadata velo yadu avoteka, introduces a reflective pause within the sequence, a grammatical widening of perspective. The relative particle asher links what follows back to the preceding gift, the manna, creating a dependent clause that both qualifies and expands it. The manna which you did not know nor your fathers knew. The particle's role is crucial. It does not simply connect propositions. It binds generations in a shared condition of unknowing. Within the relative clause, the repetition of negation and verb establishes a symmetrical pattern. The phrase lo yadata, you did not know, is mirrored by velo yadu, and they did not know, with avoteka, your fathers, completing the correspondence. The same root yada, to know, binds both halves, creating grammatical unity across generational distance. The result is a syntactic convergence. Two subjects, separated by time, joined in identical negation. The construction thus performs what it describes. It makes the past and present coincide in shared ignorance. This pattern establishes a new kind of triad, one not of causation but of convergence. The connective asher functions as the mediating node, drawing together the present you, the ancestral fathers, and the common verb of not knowing. The grammatical structure creates solidarity in limitation. In Hebrew logic, unknowing is not merely a lack, it is a binding condition. Knowledge, by contrast, often differentiates. Ignorance unites. Through the relative clause, Israel's experience of the manna becomes both unique and universal, unique in its immediacy, universal in its mystery. Theologically, this moment is indispensable. Having moved from affliction to hunger to provision, the narrative now pauses to remind the reader that the gift itself transcends comprehension. The manna, precisely because it was unknown to both recipient and ancestor, cannot be reduced to memory or tradition. Its arrival marks a rupture in historical continuity, a divine act that eludes precedent. The clause, asher lo yadata velo yadu avoteka, inscribes this rupture directly into grammar. The repetition of the negative particle loe, lo, signals a shared limit that frames revelation. The word yada, to know, is among the most intimate verbs in biblical Hebrew. It connotes not only cognition, but personal encounter. Adam knew, yada, Eve his wife. Its negation therefore expresses more than ignorance. It signifies the absence of encounter. By declaring that neither Israel nor its fathers knew the manna, the text situates revelation in a space untouched by previous relation. God's act is new, not merely in time, but in kind. The relative clause thus becomes the grammatical form of revelation's freshness. Every generation meets God at a point where knowing ends. In structural terms, this is the pivot from dependence to revelation. The prior clauses described what God did. This one names what Israel could not do, understand. The theological force of the verse depends upon this limitation. Without it, the provision of manna would risk domestication into routine. Instead, the syntax guards mystery. The negative repetition affirms that revelation remains revelation only so long as it exceeds comprehension. The not knowing becomes the medium of divine pedagogy. Thus, asher lo yadata velo yadu avoteka binds Israel to its ancestors through the common humility of ignorance. The generations converge not in knowledge possessed, but in wonder shared. This is grammar as theology. The relative clause transforms unknowing into covenant, affirming that mystery itself is the common inheritance of faith. After the symmetrical stillness of shared unknowing, the text now discloses its purpose. The phrase lema'an hodiaka reintroduces motion, teleology returning to grammar. The preposition lema'an, literally for the sake of, or in order that, governs the infinitive construct hodia, the causative of yada, to know in the hyphal stem, followed by the personal suffix ka, you. Together they express the divine intent that undergirds all the preceding actions. Affliction, hunger, and feeding occurred in order to make you know. Where the earlier clause described absence of knowledge, this one reveals the aim to instill it. The morphology transforms negation into design. The preposition lemaan signals purpose, but not mechanical causality. It does not merely explain why something happened. It draws attention to the intentional structure within the divine-human relationship. The infinitive hodiaka combines two essential features of the verse's theology: the hyphal causative stem and the second-person suffix. Knowledge, like hunger, is not self-generated. It is caused and addressed. God is the agent of knowing. Israel is its recipient. The syntax enacts this dependency through morphology. The very form of the verb makes God the giver and Israel the learner. This clause also binds the prior movements into coherence. The narrative that began with Vaya Aneka, he afflicted you, and continued through Vayar Ivka, he caused you to hunger, and Vaya Kilka et Haman, he fed you the manna, now receives its interpretive key. These were not disconnected tests or provisions. They were sequential clauses of instruction, grammatical components of a larger didactic syntax. The purpose particle lemaan turns narrative into pedagogy. What happened to Israel happened for Israel. The grammar itself speaks the logic of formation. The root yada once again governs the theological field. Earlier, its negation defined the limit of human comprehension. Here, its causative form defines the possibility of revelation. The infinitive hodia means literally to make know, implying that knowledge is not only received but brought into being. This is more than instruction, it is creation of consciousness. The preposition leman therefore introduces not a subordinate clause, but a divine motive, to bring Israel from relational ignorance into relational awareness. In structural terms, the clause serves as the hinge between the descriptive and the prescriptive, between what has been done and why it was done. Its brevity belies its density. 3 syllables, lema'an, compress the entire logic of divine intentionality. Every preceding verb finds fulfillment here. The vav conversives that carried narrative time now converge on a single infinitive that explains their direction. The hyphal stems that express divine causation culminate in the causation of knowledge itself. Grammar reaches its theological climax. God teaches through syntax. Theologically, this clause restores purpose to pain. Affliction and hunger are not retribution, but revelation's architecture. The personal suffix ka ensures that the knowledge aimed at is not collective only, but intimate. The addressee is singular, as though the entire wilderness pedagogy were addressed to one soul. The divine intent is therefore pedagogical and personal. The grammar of Leman Hodiaka defines the entire wilderness narrative as an educational process, God teaching through experience what could not be learned through instruction alone. In this way, Deuteronomy 8:3 presents knowledge not as the antithesis of mystery, but as its fulfillment. The earlier unknowing prepared the ground. This clause plants the seed. The infinitive to make know does not cancel the previous not knowing. It dignifies it as necessary prelude. Ignorance was not failure, but invitation. Grammar once again mirrors grace. The clause of purpose transforms human limitation into divine intention. To live by the word of God, the verse implies, is to inhabit this structure, to recognize that every affliction, hunger, and gift belongs to the same pedagogical syntax, designed lema an hodiaka, in order that you might know. At this point in the verse, the text arrives at what later translations made its center, but which, in Hebrew, is its turning boundary. The clause, Kilo al-halekem levado yichya ha'adam, reverses the direction of divine discourse. What had been a sequence of verbs describing God's actions now becomes a general statement about human existence. Yet its grammatical structure remains tightly woven with what came before. The particle ki, variously translated that, for, or because, here introduces both explanation and contrast. It signals that what follows is the interpretive culmination of the prior narrative. All that God has done, he has done to teach this truth. The negative lo defines the clause's logical axis. It is not the negation of being, but of sufficiency. The prepositional phrase al-halechem, upon the bread, establishes the material ground, and the modifying term levado, alone or by itself, restricts that ground to the purely physical. The verb yikhye, shall live, drawn from chaya, to live, follows, and the clause concludes with ha'adam, the human, or humanity. The syntax therefore arranges itself around an excluded sufficiency. It is not upon bread alone that humanity lives. The placement of yikhye, midway between negation and subject, is significant. The verb is grammatically constrained by what precedes, not by bread alone, but semantically reaches forward to the next clause, where the true source of life will be affirmed. In the Hebrew cadence, the word life hangs suspended between denial and fulfillment, a pivot between two truths. The structure thus embodies limitation as revelation. The negative boundary is not an endpoint, but a channel through which a deeper affirmation will emerge. Theologically, the clause articulates the doctrine of insufficiency, not as moral reproach but as metaphysical safeguard. The bread, halechem, symbolizes the realm of material provision that the preceding verbs described so concretely. By inserting lo, levado, the text protects creation from idolatry. It denies autonomy to matter without denying its goodness. The bread feeds, but it cannot sustain life in isolation. The negation thus functions as a protective perimeter, preserving the ontological order in which all material sustenance remains dependent on the divine utterance that animates it. This protective negation carries forward the pedagogical logic established earlier. The purpose clause, lema an hodiaka, in order to make you know, finds its object here. The knowledge to be imparted is precisely this, that life is never self-contained. The repetition of yikhye, which will reappear in the next clause, underlines continuity between negation and affirmation. The human verb of existence remains the same, only its ground changes. Thus, even grammar participates in theology. The predicate of living is fixed, while its prepositional support shifts from bread to utterance. Philosophically, this line rejects the reduction of being to sustenance, of existence to survival. It posits that the human condition cannot be fully explained by physical continuance. Yet in Hebrew, this is not an abstract principle, but a relational statement. The word Adam recalls the first human, formed of dust but animated by divine breath. The verb yikhye echoes that breath's ongoing activity. The grammar reenacts Genesis. Life is the interplay between matter and spirit, between ground and word. Consequently, kilo al-halechem levado yikhye ha'adam is not a denunciation of bread but of isolation. It negates life divorced from relation, whether relation to God, to word, or to time. The clause stands as a syntactic threshold, drawing the limits of material adequacy in preparation for the next revelation. Its kilo opens space for ki al, the affirmative clause that follows. The sequence of negation and affirmation is not argumentative but harmonic. Denial and declaration form two movements of a single revelation. Thus, the sixth clause does not yet offer completion. It creates vacancy. The grammatical negative becomes the theological interval into which divine speech will soon enter. Bread alone cannot sustain. Yet, in its insufficiency, it gestures toward the utterance that can. The verse pauses here, suspended between substance and word, holding its breath before pronouncing life's true source. The verse culminates in this clause, where negation gives way to affirmation, and the suspended verb yikhye, shall live, finally finds its true foundation. The phrase ki al kol motza pi Adonai completes the thought left open by the preceding ki lo al halechem levado. The conjunction key again serves as the connective hinge, now functioning adversatively, or rather, what was denied as insufficient is now replaced with what alone suffices, the living utterance of God. The prepositional phrase al-kol, upon every, introduces both scope and dependence. It locates the source of life upon something yet that something is not material but verbal. The noun motza, from the root yatsa, to go out or to come forth, designates that which proceeds or issues forth. It can denote the emergence of speech, of command, or of creative impulse. Here it appears in construct with pi, mouth of, forming motza pi Adonai, literally, the going forth of the mouth of Yahweh. The construct state fuses source and emanation. What proceeds is inseparable from the one who speaks. The divine mouth is not a metaphorical organ, but a locus of origin, where utterance and being coincide. Theologically, this construction restores to language its creative ontology. The same divine mouth that spoke the world into being now speaks life into humanity. The root yatsa, which elsewhere marks physical departure or emergence, is here transposed into metaphysical register. Life proceeds from procession. The Word of God is not commentary on existence, it is existence in motion. Grammar mirrors this theology. The participial noun motza captures both action and result, what issues forth and what is issued. The phrase thus spans tense, encompassing continual emanation. The verb yikye, repeated from the preceding clause, unites the two statements across their polarity. The same word that once hovered between negation and fulfillment now lands on solid ground. Life is grammatically and theologically anchored upon utterance. The subject ha'adam, again the human, maintains continuity with the Genesis prototype, dust animated by divine breath. The syntactic repetition of subject and verb across both clauses, Yihya ha'adam, establishes a rhythm of balance. Humanity lives, but its ground of living has shifted from matter to word. This repetition is not redundancy, but revelation. The parallel syntax invites direct comparison between the two al-phrases, al-halekem levado, on bread alone, and al-kol motza pi Adonai, on every utterance of the mouth of Yahweh. The movement from halekem to motza is not merely thematic, but ontological. The preposition al, which denotes dependence, functions here as the bridge between physical and metaphysical sustenance. Both bread and word stand as supports of life, but the second clause expands the field. The object of dependence is no longer a single substance, but every emanation of divine speech. The inclusion of kol, every, universalizes the source. Life flows from all that proceeds from God, not from any one command or provision. In linguistic terms, the clause is symmetrical perfection. Its elements, conjunction, preposition, quantifier, construct chain, verb and subject, form a self-contained logic of life. Yet each part refers beyond itself. The grammar enacts procession, preposition leading to noun, noun to construct, construct to divine name, and finally to the living verb. Even syntax becomes a model of emanation. The theological implication is equally profound. Whereas bread sustains by consumption, the divine word sustains by communication. To live upon every utterance is to live in perpetual reception. The verse here defines life as a linguistic condition. Existence depends on the continuous issuance of meaning from the divine source. Humanity's dependence on food is temporal. Its dependence on utterance is ontological. The former maintains the body, the latter constitutes being itself. In this final clause, the verse's grammar and theology converge. The sequence that began with affliction and hunger now resolves not in satiation, but in relation. The human lives upon, that is, within, the ongoing discourse of God. Every verb that preceded this point finds its purpose here. God afflicts, hungers, feeds, reveals, and instructs, in order that the human may live by speech, by word, by the unceasing procession of the divine mouth. Thus, ki al kol motza pi Adonai yikye ha'adam is not a conclusion, but an opening. It does not close the narrative. It establishes the perpetual condition under which all narratives continue. The clause stands as the living pivot between grammar and creation, language as the medium of life, and life as the reception of language. The 7 clauses of Deuteronomy 8:3 do not stand as separate observations, but as sequential transmutations of one reality. Each arises organically from the tensions of the one preceding it, so that the entire verse becomes a continuous dialectic of dependence and disclosure, a movement from condition to comprehension, from experience to expression. The structure itself teaches by the way it unfolds. Affliction begins the motion by isolating the human from abstraction. In being afflicted, the collective you becomes a discernible addressee. The experience of being acted upon creates the first boundary of personhood. The self is marked by what it suffers. Yet isolation cannot remain its own end. The grammar demands continuity. The vav that connects clauses also connects stages of awareness. Out of affliction grows hunger. Hunger emerges as the interiorization of affliction. Where affliction is externally imposed, hunger is internally felt. What was pressure from without becomes yearning within. Thus, affliction individualizes and hunger personalizes. The human is no longer merely the object of divine action, but the subject of desire, a being whose emptiness now speaks. That speech calls forth response, feeding. Feeding arrives not as reversal but as integration. It takes the polarity of lack and fulfillment and joins them in a single grammatical act. The one who afflicts is the same who feeds. The object who suffered becomes the recipient of intentional sustenance. What hunger revealed as need, feeding interprets as relationship. The outer act of provision mirrors the inner motion of reconciliation. Emptiness and presence coalesce. But integration is unstable without reflection. The next movement, the confession of unknowing, preserves the mystery of what has occurred. Ignorance binds the experience within the humility of perspective. Having been fed, Israel might presume understanding. The syntax forbids it. Which you did not know, nor your fathers knew, introduces shared limitation as the necessary counterbalance to revelation. Ignorance universalizes what feeding particularized. It reminds that divine generosity exceeds comprehension, that relation to God is maintained only through acknowledged mystery. From that shared limitation arises instruction. The purpose clause, in order to make you know, transforms ignorance into pedagogy. What was once the boundary of knowledge becomes its condition. God does not merely supply information, but forms consciousness through the oscillation between knowing and not knowing. Instruction thus emerges as the synthesis of dependence and disclosure. Humanity learns that understanding itself is a gift, mediated through experience rather than detached from it. Negation follows as the ethical application of that awareness. Man does not live by bread alone defines the perimeter within which knowledge must operate. Once the human has been taught that all sustenance is relational, the text inscribes that relation as law. Negation is grammar's way of guarding theology. It draws the line beyond which comprehension becomes idolatry. To negate bread's sufficiency is to preserve the integrity of its giver. Affirmation, finally, completes the circuit that affliction began. But by every utterance from the mouth of Yahweh shall man live, restores what negation withheld, placing the human back within the continuum of divine speech. Life no longer depends upon the visible provision, but upon the invisible articulation that sustains all being. The process has turned full circle. The God who afflicted by word now animates by word. What began as the cry of the afflicted ends as participation in divine utterance. Thus, the sevenfold arc moves with deliberate coherence from affliction to hunger, to feeding, to ignorance, to instruction, to negation, to affirmation. Each step arises as both resolution and reorientation of the one before. The verse is not a string of events, but a living sequence of transformations in which grammar becomes revelation. The afflicted one becomes the addressed one, the hungry becomes the receptive, and the living human emerges as the audible echo of the divine mouth. What Deuteronomy 8:3 ultimately reveals is not simply a doctrine of dependence, but a structure of consciousness. The divine pedagogy recorded here unfolds through syntax, not abstraction. Every prefix, stem, and suffix performs an act of theology. The verse does not speak about how God teaches. It teaches by speaking. It allows language itself to become the medium through which divine intentionality enters human awareness. The sevenfold sequence begins in affliction, the interruption of equilibrium, and culminates in affirmation, the restoration of equilibrium at a higher order. Between these 2 points stretches the entire drama of relation, the awakening of need, the meeting of that need, the recognition of mystery, the reception of instruction, and the disciplined drawing of limits that prepares for renewal. The grammar thus mirrors creation itself, differentiation, desire, formation, revelation, and finally harmony within speech. The verse becomes a linguistic microcosm of divine economy, a world spoken, sustained, and understood through utterance. To read this text structurally is therefore to recover an ancient intuition that life is grammatical. Existence unfolds according to relational syntax. Being is not a noun, but a verb continually conjugated by divine address. The human creature lives not by possession, but by participation, not by what is held, but by what is heard. Bread nourishes only because the word sustains it. Language is the deeper metabolism of the soul. In this light, the verse's final declaration, "By every utterance from the mouth of Yahweh shall man live," is not conclusion but condition. It defines life as ongoing reception of divine articulation. To live is to be grammatically open, receptive to the procession of meaning that issues from the mouth of God into the fabric of time. There is a reason the Torah tells us this story in a single verse. It is not only compact, it is patterned. Every clause fits into the next like gears in a machine, not just to recount what God did, but to show how it was done. But if the mechanism can be followed, it can be replicated, and that is where the danger begins. The system that once formed Israel in the wilderness was divine, yes, but it was also structural. And once that structure is made visible, it can be imitated, not to lead into covenant, but to lead into compliance, not to make people wise, but to make people manageable. If we have studied the shape of Deuteronomy 8:3 to learn how God teaches, we must now study it again to understand how power copies God, to replace pedagogy with programming. Because someone is always doing it. There is always an actor, a regime, a charismatic leader, a theocratic bureaucracy, a closed ideological network that has learned to borrow the holy form for unholy ends. And they are counting on you not recognizing the pattern. That is why the Torah gives it to you, so you will. First, the actor will afflict you, not by accident, not by fate, but by design. They will introduce crisis, personal, economic, moral, or social, and ensure that it feels like it was meant for you. The pressure will be precise. It will isolate you and convince you that your pain is proof you are being worked on, taught, or formed. They will teach you to confuse trauma with attention. Once you believe that suffering is your invitation to meaning, they will have their opening. Then they will hunger you. They will withhold what you need, not to destroy you, but to make you ask. The withholding will be interpreted as wisdom, even as love. Your need will become your education. The lack will be explained as your lesson. But the actor knows what this is. Not pedagogy, but the fabrication of dependence. Then they will feed you, but only from their hand. The same one who created the scarcity now becomes your savior. What they give will meet your need, but not restore your agency. You will not know where it came from. You will not be allowed to reproduce it. Only they hold the secret of the manna. It will not be food. It will be leverage. And in your gratitude, you will forget. You will forget what came before, because they will sever your memory. They will tell you that no one has ever known this way before, that your fathers never saw it, that no one ever understood until they arrived. History will become a threat and tradition a rival. You will be told to start over, with them. And with the memory erased, they will now reinterpret your pain. They will explain it all. You suffered, they will say, because you needed to. Every hardship will be redefined as a teaching moment. Every grievance becomes a lesson, not for them, but for you. They will take the very wounds they gave you and use them to prove their insight. This is not instruction. It is absolution masquerading as pedagogy. Then they will redefine what it means to live. They will tell you that survival, real survival, cannot be achieved by bread or independence or material sufficiency. You will be told that true life is something only they can define. Your ability to live apart from them will be branded empty. You will begin to question whether you can live without their meaning. You will no longer know where you end and they begin. And finally, they will bind your life to their word. This is the final conversion, when the system becomes God. You will be told that every breath, every purpose, every pulse of existence depends on their voice, their doctrine, their instruction, and when they fall silent, the silence will terrify you, because you will no longer remember how to live without it. That is the full arc, not just a pattern, a strategy, a manual for the creation of devotional control. It wears the language of Torah, but it speaks in the voice of occupation. The grammar is divine, the actor is not. And this is why the Torah gives you the structure, not just to understand what God has done, but to recognize when someone else is doing it in his name. So ask always, who is speaking? Who benefits from my affliction? Who designed the lack I now feel grateful to have filled? Who requires my ignorance to explain my suffering? Who defines life in terms I cannot verify? Who must speak for me to exist? If the answer is not God, it is the actor. And if you do not see the pattern, they already have you. But if you do see it, the pattern becomes your defense. The Torah is not just the record of covenant, it is the blueprint of how covenant is counterfeited. And in that, it gives you the last gift, not only the way to trust God, but the way to know when someone is trying to take his place.